All right, so it's officially 12:02 Eastern Time, so let's get things started. So here's what we're here to talk about today. And this is really a simple thing to ask, isn't it? I just want my prints to look like they look like on my monitor. And that's probably one of the biggest complaints I hear from photographers, particularly from wedding photographers for some reason, that you're getting prints back and they just don't color match, they're dark, the color's off. And I want to show you ways that you can almost completely eliminate that from happening. Yes, occasionally he will have human error creep in, either on your part or on the lab's part, but we're going to do our best to minimize that. So I'm your host. That's the best picture you're going to get of me today. Wow, do I look like I need sleep there? My name is Joe Brady. I am one of the X-Rite Colorati. I'm a specialist in color. I'm an author. I teach photography. I do workshops all over the United States and all over the world. And I'm also a member of Sony's Artisans of Imagery program. But enough about me. Let's talk about the subject. So here's what we're after. Wouldn't it be really nice to just get back prints that match your monitor? And the steps I'm going to take you through will ensure that that happens. You just need a little bit of gear. You need a little know-how in software. But if you follow these steps, I can assure you that you're going to get great looking prints. Now, there are, of course, some caveats. A print is a different medium than what you see on your monitor, but we'll talk about that as well later. So as we go through today, here's how we're going to approach. I'll talk a little bit about the process and why we need to do this. We'll take a look at a couple of pieces of gear that will make the process easy. And then we're going to put everything together. We're going to go first into a Lightroom, and we're going to go into Photoshop. And I'll show you how to soft-proof and adjust and save a file that you can then send out to your lab and be ensured that this is what you're going to get back. So let's start by taking a look at the gear. Now there's two places where color is critical, and probably one even more than the other. The first one is your monitor. And the monitor is the single most important thing you have to make sure is under control, because that's where you're making your decisions about color and tone and everything else and brightness. If you don't get your monitor under control, then everything you're doing is guessing. And what we're after is no more guessing. Now the other part is actually with your raw image, and hopefully you guys are shooting raw because, well, JPEGs really have a lot of limitations, including the inability to use custom camera profiles. So I hope when you see this, you're going to be converted over to shooting raw, at least when it is applicable. I'll also talk about some places where you can get a best result with JPEGs as well. So what we're going to do is we're going to start with color at capture. I'm going to talk about the color checker passport a little bit, which is that little color chart down in the bottom right of the screen, because this is a place where you can really ensure that you're going to get great color in your files. And this will really make sense when we go into Lightroom and Photoshop. So the color checker passport, what is it? Well, you've probably seen this chart down the bottom. This thing's been around forever as the color checker, the Macbeth color checker way back when. You've probably seen it in studio shoots. This is probably my single favorite piece of gear. I do not do a single shoot without this thing. I am completely dedicated to having one of these with me wherever I go. Why? It provides me a set of standard colors that the software can then make everything snap into place. And again, when you see this put into action, you're going to want one if you don't have one already. And the reason it's really necessary is because out in the digital camera world, there are no standards for color. And this first line I mentioned, what does red mean? Well, you would think that everybody agreed as to what red means, but they don't. If you've ever done a shoot with multiple cameras, or you've maybe a wedding shooter and you've got a second shooter who's shooting with a second camera, maybe even a different brand, you're going to find that your color response is going to be very different. By having these standard set of colors, that is eliminated. And that's one of the greatest things. Also, if you happen to be in an environment where there's a lot of one big color, for example, I shoot in the desert Southwest a lot. And so imagine Monument Valley, where the entire place is filled with this reddish brown sandstone. Well, that color reflects up onto everything, and it kind of color pollutes the entire scene. If your camera is trying to do white balance, it just doesn't have a clue. It completely freaks out. And I found that one of the hardest places to get color correct, and the color checker passport does that. So what it allows you to do is to create a custom camera profile. Now, it sounds complicated. It's actually very simple. You'll be amazed how easy it is to do. It does give you a standard color reference, and it gives you white balance. The enhancements also are in the top target. I'll show you those in just a second. Let's start with the main target. This is the Color Checker Classic. This is the set of colors that you've seen forever. And actually, if you look at the target, you can see, well, we've got a kind of a gray ramp, a white to black up on top. But look at the second row. Look at this, red, green, blue. And here's CMYK, the standard color sets. Underneath it are colors that occur in nature. And these are all standard colors. They are known values. And when you take a picture of this thing, the software takes a look at the image file and it sees, well, for example, this red, what really showed up. The software knows what the values for that red should be. If it's different, then the profiles creates a set of corrections for that. And that's basically what profiles are. They're a set of corrections to make sure that when color goes from one place to another, it's translated correctly. One of the other targets on the Color Checker Passport is a white balance target. Now, if you are a JPEG shooter, for example, one of the things that our studio does is we do school photography. And in school photography, you definitely need to make sure that your white balance is correct, but also it is a JPEG environment. I do admit it, it's the one time we shoot JPEGs because the lab softwares want that. Now, we could shoot RAW and process them all over, but it's just not an efficient workflow. So what we can do instead is do a custom white balance for our lights in that environment using this card. Now, the card's not that big. It's, I don't know, 4x5, 4x6 inches. And you might think, well, that's too small, but you do not need to fill the frame when doing a custom white balance on your camera. You just need to generally fill that center focusing circle. That is what your camera is generally going to use to create a custom white balance, but as always, read your manual. The third target is called, oh, that's wrong, it's not a white balance target. This is the enhancement target. Bad title, my fault. And what the enhancement target does is it allows you to create custom white balances. Now, these rows down here in the middle, you'll see one has a little head, that's a portrait row, and then a landscape row below. Now, I don't know if you have a calibrated monitor, but if you do, you might see that this first target looks pretty neutral, and it is. This is a white balance target, as is the middle one on the second row. Now, you might notice as the targets go from left to right that they get a very little bit kind of slightly cyan, slightly blue. And what happens is when you white balance off of a target that's slightly cyan, slightly blue, it has the opposite effect on the image. So in this case, it would warm it rather than cool it. When you click on something that's slightly blue, it has the opposite effect. The opposite of blue is, excuse me, the opposite of blue is yellow. The opposite of cyan is red. So the combination of that cyan blue, slightly blue patch is going to add a little bit of warmth to the image. Now down below, this one is neutral, and you can see we go slightly blue off to the right. Slightly off to the left, it goes slightly magenta, slightly pink. That's going to enhance green, so you might want to try that for landscapes. Now the nice thing about this is, particularly if you're doing portraits, I've found, if you always want to get a little bit of warmth, I often will choose either the second or third patch in to add that little bit of warmth because everybody wants the skin to look warm. If you remember, I don't know how many of you guys used to shoot film, but film was always warmer. And that's what people have grown to be used to. And this allows you to get to exactly the same amount of warmth every time with just one click. All right, let's talk about monitor calibration. Now, if you're not doing this, then you're guessing, and I don't care what monitor you have. I'm working on my laptop right now. I've got an iMac 27-inch next to me that is hooked up to an ASO monitor. All three of them are calibrated, and they have to be. And you'll be amazed if you haven't calibrated in several months when you recalibrate how much a shift in color and brightness that your monitor has. Since your monitor is your window to everything you're doing, it's got to be calibrated. I recommend at the minimum, at least every 3 months. If it's a laptop, once a month. If you have a really high-end monitor, 3 months is fine. But you do need to make sure this is done. Also, what I like to do, if I'm going to send out a big print job to a lab, I will, before I actually send those files out and I want to do a final proof on my images, I'll do a calibration. So let's take a look at some of the choices for calibration, the hardware. First off, the Color Monkey display. I love this device. In fact, I've got one sitting on my desk right now. It is very easy to use. It assumes no knowledge on your part. You really just listen to what it says on the screen, put it up on your screen, and click go, and it just takes over. It's very powerful. It's very easy to use, but it also is very accurate. Now, if you're a data guy, if you really want to check your data, the next step up from there is the i1 Display Pro. Similar device, you can see it's silver instead of black. The biggest change is the software it uses. It actually uses the same software that the top of the line i1 Pro system, which is $1,200 to $1,500. It uses that same software to do its monitor calibration. And what it provides you is a lot more colors, so you can get an even more accurate profile in your display. And it also will track the performance of your display over time. This is useful if you've got an older display. You'll actually see each time you do a calibration and profiling what the data is doing, how far it is out of normal. And if you see this trending downward, that's kind of a signal that it might be time to start shopping for a new monitor. Now, the third device we'll talk about, and yes, there are some other choices, but the third one we'll talk about real quick is the ColorMonkey Photo. I've been using the ColorMonkey Photo for, I'm not sure, 8 or 9 years at this point. And it does the same things as far as the other two devices we saw. It will do monitors. It will also calibrate projectors. But since I do a lot of my own printing, it also allows me to create custom printer profiles, which is a subject for another day. But if you do a lot of your own printing as well, in addition to sending out to a lab, you might want to take a look at the ColorMonkey Photo. Because factory paper profiles sometimes are pretty good, oftentimes are pretty terrible, but when you create a custom printer profile for your own printer on your own paper, you're getting an exact picture of what that device is capable of, and it does the best mapping of the colors from your computer to that printer. So all these devices have one thing in common, and that's the process for creating a monitor calibration is kind of the same. Now remember, I mentioned on the Color Checker Passport there's all those standard colors. Well, the software for these devices does a similar thing. It just sends the color up to the screen, and then the device reads what actually shows up. So here you see the ColorMonkey display sitting on a monitor. And when the software starts, I'm not going to do it for you because it takes 5 minutes and it'd be pretty boring to watch colors come up on my screen. But it will send colors up to the screen. So for example, we talked about red before. At one point, it's going to send 100% red up to the screen. Well, the device will read that. Invariably, the color that it sees is slightly different or very different than what the data says this color is. So let's say, for example, it's supposed to be 100% red, but the device sees, oh, it also has 5% blue and 3% green in it. Well, that is the data that is used to create a profile. And again, a profile is just a set of corrections. So after the profile is generated, when the reading is done, when your software, Photoshop, Lightroom, whatever, sends an image up to the screen, if there's a place where there's 100% red, all of that information goes through the profile on its way to the screen. And the profile says, well, if you really want to see 100% red, we have to take out 5% of blue and 3% green, and then you really will get 100% red. And in essence, that's how monitor profiling works. And again, as I mentioned, do this at least every 3 months if you've got a new monitor, a really good monitor. If it's an older system, you want to go at least once a month. And again, before you send out a print job, go ahead and profile. And yes, you can profile your laptop. It's just as important as your desktop machines. So as I mentioned, we're going to go first into Lightroom and then into Photoshop. I'm going to show you how to create profiles and put them to use. So I'm actually in Lightroom. Let me just get out of my full screen mode, and I'm going to go get some demo images, and let's see how to create a profile. Now this is a shot actually taken mostly with available light, but with some fill flash because you can see it in her eyes. This is Josie. She's a young dancer who we had a lot of fun with at a recent shoot in Savannah. Now, so how do you create a profile? Well, it's extremely simple. You simply take a picture of the device in the environment you're in. Now, this is a little small. It should fill a little bit more of the frame, but you'll see that this will actually work. I generally prefer to do something like this, where it's filling a little more of the frame, but this is actually enough. A little bigger is a little better. The other thing is you want to make sure that the device is exposed correctly. You got to make sure that the color checker does not have any clipping on it. And the way you can check that is, I'm in the Develop module in Lightroom. Under the histogram, I'm just going to click on the highlight warning, which is this little triangle in the upper right-hand corner, and we see we have some clipping here, means it's gone pure white, but it's in the sky outside of the image. So the exposure of the color checker itself is perfect. So let's go ahead. We can turn this off because it's annoying. I don't have to crop. I don't have to white balance. I don't have to do anything because the software knows where the neutral patches is. It will find the target and it will do its thing from there. So here's how easy it is to do. When you install the software that comes with the color checker, excuse me, you will have an option under Export with Preset in Lightroom, and you'll see Color Checker Passport shows up. So I click on that and I give it a name. Well, this was Fill Flash, so I'll call it Fill Flash, and just to remind me, Savannah. And I click on Save, and that's it. That's how easy it is to create a custom profile for your camera. You can see in the upper left here that it says it's processing the profile, 45 seconds or so, I find to be usual. And Lightroom does need to be restarted after a profile is created because it doesn't update into the plugins. And by the way, if you create a profile in Lightroom, Adobe Camera Raw will see it, and vice versa. If you create a profile using the desktop app, which I'll show you in a second, Lightroom sees it because all of the products use the same plugins folder for their profiles. Now, before you ask, these profiles, one, only work with RAW files. You can't do it with a JPEG or a TIFF or a PSD. They've already got all their color information built into them. Secondly, they only work with the Adobe suite. Other programs like Capture One and any of the Corel stuff, they all use an ICC back end for their color management, and these custom profiles work in DNG. Now, notice I didn't have to do any saving. There was nothing that changed. The software automatically creates a DNG that it needs to run in the background. And by the way, all the Adobe stuff works in DNG in the background. Okay, so here's our little message that the profile has been created correctly. And again, like any good cooking show, I already had one in the oven for you. So let's go ahead. I want to show you what happens. Here's our profile. So I'm going to go back up into the basic panel here, and I'm going to click on white balance. And I'm going to pick one of the first two targets. I can click the whitest one. And you can see the numbers on the bottom, the 90.1, 90.8, 93.6. That's showing the white balance of that particular patch. If it's perfectly neutral, those will all be even. So if I click on there, now you can see the image went a little yellower. It took some of that blue out, but that's more correct. Now here is the problem that gets solved. If you go down to camera calibration down the bottom of the develop module, you'll see there's an Adobe standard profile. Now the problem with the Adobe standard profile it is very safe. It is very neutral and it's slightly subdued. For some reason, certain colors are weaker. And if you were to hold up a color checker passport in front of you, in particular, you would see that some of these colors are actually much deeper, in particular these blues. So let's go ahead and apply the profile that we created for this. And what did I call it? I called it, let's see. Look at the colors. Did you see them all jump there? So here's A7R shade. This was shot with my Sony A7R. Here's the Adobe standard, and look at how weak the colors are compared to there. Now again, if you held a color checker passport in front of you, that's what you would see, not that that other thing. Now, after this, you're looking at this image through the correct profile, through an accurate white balance. Now you can go ahead and make your decisions as to what you want to do with it. Now, I could do it to this image, or I can go to another image. So here's an image where she has gotten rid of it, and now I can do all of my edits. So if I go ahead and apply the profile again, A7R shade, you can see, wow, did you see her jacket? Let me back off on that again. That was pretty cool. So there's the Adobe standard. Look at her denim jacket. And it actually wasn't quite this faded. When I click on shade, look, the color comes back. By doing this, I know that I'm now editing the correct colors, and I can do everything else I want to do. I'm going to bring the highlights down, and maybe I want to warm things up a little bit. I'm going to add a little bit more saturation. And I could also decide, well, I want to warm up her skin a little more. Actually, that's looking pretty good. And I'm going to crop it down. Let's just make it a 8x10 kind of size print. So I'll come over here. And looking much better. The other thing I want to do is I want to darken her skin here a little bit so that we're focused more on her face. And there's a lot of ways to do this. This is a subject for another day. I'm going to bring down the highlights and the exposure on the lower part of her body, and voila. And if you're happy with it, you can then select all the images that were done in this part of the shoot. Let's imagine I had 30 images here. I could then click on synchronize, and I don't need to check all. I want the white balance, the process version, and the calibration. And when I click synchronize, the white balance and the custom profile get applied to all those images. Now, if I found I wanted all of the other changes I made as well, I could just check all and maybe not have them all cropped the same. And then any edit I had done to basic tone, exposure, etc. will get applied to all those images. And guess what? Your color editing is done. That's it. That's how easy it is. Just imagine how much time you've saved. And here's my sales pitch. And the reason is because I really believe in the color checker. This thing will pay for itself the first time you use it. Just the amount of time you're not going to spend in front of the computer making this happen. So let me just check a couple of questions here. Someone just mentioned about Azo. Azo does have a software of their own called Color Navigator. And yes, I also use the Color Navigator software. It does not work with the ColorMonkey display, but if you do get the i1 Display Pro, the next one up, that does work with the Azo software. And Rick asked if it works on Capture One Pro, and again, unfortunately, the answer is no. Sorry to pass that on. Let's see. Someone asked, another thing about this. Let's say you get a color checker now and you've got images you shot 5 years ago. Well, if you still have the camera, you can go back and create profiles for it and do your updates, and you're going to find all your colors going to snap in place. The other beauty is, as I mentioned earlier, if you happen to be, say, a wedding shooter and you've got a second shooter who's using maybe a different model or even a different brand of camera, if you just take a picture of the color checker, like we did here, just take a picture of the color checker with each camera and create a profile for it. What's going to happen is your cameras are going to match their color responses because they're now using the same set of color references to create their profile. When they have the same references, they're all going to match. How easy was that? Now, before we get into the editing part and sending images out to the lab, we're going to go into the desktop app. Actually, let me do one more. Here's another one. This is in Arches National Park, and again, we can see that the colors are kind of washed out and has nothing to do with exposure. They're just a little too bright. So I'm going to I can go choose my white balance first. So I'll come over here and choose my white balance, and we can see, all right, there's already been a big change just from the white balance, because the auto white balance, as I mentioned, in this environment freaks out. It just does not work. Let's take a look at that again. Here's what auto white balance, and the camera saw it as 5300K at +8 on the tint. When we do a custom white balance off of the target, we see it drops down to 4800K. So that's the actual color temperature that is coming up onto the target. And so then as we scroll down to the calibration tab, click on here. This was in Moab, and wow, look at the colors. Look what has happened. Look how deep those blues got. And what does that mean? Well, if you've ever been out west, and this is Double Arch in Arches National Park, if you've ever been out west, you'd notice that for us Easterners, when you look up at the sky, it actually looks unnatural. It looks unnaturally blue because there's much less moisture in the air. So the blues are very intense because there's a bigger red component to it. So watch what happens as I apply the profile to this image. Watch the sky. Look at how amazing that looks. And that's what it looks like out there. That's what the sky looks like, not that kind of dull thing. Now, also, if you remember, our white balance was different. So I'm going to come back here. We already set this one up. This already has the correct white balance, the custom white balance, and the profile. And what I could do, here's 3 shots in a row that were shot out there. Click on Synchronize. And again, I want white balance, process, and calibration. Click on Sync, and then the color editing for my colors all snaps into place. You can then, of course, flavor to your liking. But what this does is it gives you a perfect starting point so that the image you see is really going to match what really happened there. So before we move on to the actual process of creating the file for the lab, I want to jump into the other app that comes with the color checker, and it's called Color Checker Passport. Now, the reason that you would use this is, well, you're not a Lightroom user. So let me hide the other so we have a clean screen here. And what the software asks you to do is to load an image. You can either drag it in, or you can just go to File, Add Image, and I chose this image. What the software does is it automatically goes and looks for the target and makes sure it finds it. Now, if I zoom out of here, you can see it's actually the same shot I just used before. It just automatically zooms and crops in. Now, what it also gives you is if by chance the software had problems finding the target. This is pretty rare. I had it happen once when I had this target sitting on a table that was kind of like a ceramic grid. So it had black lines and then the black squares, and it got a little confused. If that happens, you can click on this button right here, and you can then drag these green dots to tell it where the corners of the target are. And you'll see this green squares in each target sample are where it is going to sample from. So just like when we were in Lightroom, you just simply click on Create Profile, give it a name that makes sense. It's going to choose the camera name by default, but give it something that makes sense to you. So I'll call it Arches Daylight. Now, I don't actually need to put the camera name in the profile because the profiles are linked to the camera through the metadata. So when you go into your software, be it Lightroom or Adobe Camera Raw, you're only going to see the profiles for that camera. If you shoot multiple cameras, you're just going to see a list for each of those. So I would click on Save, and it's going to do its thing. By the way, while this is generating, another question that came up is, how many different profiles do you need? Under what conditions? You can get away with one. You can just create a daylight one. However, I find it more useful to have one for daylight, one for cloudy, one for shade, and then for all my lighting conditions, meaning if I'm using strobes, if I'm using speed lights, if I'm under tungsten or fluorescent lights, I will create one for each of those conditions. And then lastly, if I'm in some kind of odd mixed condition, maybe it's a combination of daylight and tungsten or fluorescent, or maybe I'm in a place like out in Utah where you have all that red dirt reflecting up, I'll create a profile just for there. So you see, just like we saw in Lightroom, it says the profile has been created successfully and applications may need to be restarted. They're talking about Lightroom. If you're in Adobe Camera Raw, it does not have to do anything. So that's how you create one if you're not in Lightroom. In this day and age, pretty much everybody's in Lightroom and Photoshop. Face it, resistance is futile. You're going to be using one of those two. So let me quit this. Let's go back into Lightroom. And let's see how to take one of these images and prepare it for print. Actually, let's, as long as we're here, we'll do a portrait and a landscape. So let's choose this arch landscape that we just had. Now I want to send this out to my lab. Now in Lightroom, there is no color settings that you have any control over until you actually go to export. Lightroom is working in a version of ProPhoto RGB all the time behind the scenes. Now what you can do is click on this button right here. See, it says soft proofing. So we're going to click on this. And while we're in here, oh, by the way, when you click on soft proofing, you may get white in your background. If you control or right click in this gray area, you can change it. That's kind of the default. I prefer a dark gray. You can make it as light or dark as you want. I like it to match the rest of the screen. I find it less interfering. Notice when we chose soft proofing, we got a new histogram with new options. So I'm going to create a proof copy, which is just for this particular print job. And there's a couple of choices I have here. First of all, this one right here, this monitor thing, is showing you all of the colors that your monitor can't display correctly. Now, I mentioned I'm working on a laptop. Well, the laptop cannot show you these colors. It's beyond sRGB, which is what your laptops are operating in. Now, technically, there's nothing you can do about that. This is one of the advantages of having an Adobe RGB display like my Azo that I have nearby. You wouldn't be able to see that on this broadcast because the internet works in sRGB as well. However, it's just a warning to let you know these are the colors that are out of gamut for the monitor. Now this is kind of a heads up as to what your rendering intent is going to be, and we'll get to that in just a second. So let's turn that off, and then on the right hand side we have the colors that are out of gamut for the destination, and the destination in this case is sRGB. What this is saying is, now this blue in actuality is actually even deeper and more intense than we're seeing on the screen, but our sRGB screens cannot show it to us. So what this is telling us is there's actually a fair amount of color that is out of gamut, meaning it's beyond what the print and the display can show us. Because remember, the lab printers also work in sRGB or something very close to it. So what can you do about that? Well, I can't make this color come into gamut, but the safety of having an sRGB display is this is the color that is going to print. Now I can switch back and forth on our rendering intents between perceptual and relative. So as we go back and forth, well, in our sRGB display, we don't get to see anything. If you were on an Adobe RGB display, you'd have a greater chance of seeing a shift here. However, since there is a fair amount of color out of gamut, all of that blue is out of gamut. When you have a lot of color out of gamut, I'd recommend choosing perceptual. It does a best job of keeping your gradation smooth and keeping the relationships between colors. If you have just a little bit out of gamut, then relative is a good way to go, because relative causes a very little bit of color shift compared to perceptual. However, if you have a lot of color out of gamut, relative rendering intent can cause a little bit of banding and artifacts. So in this image, when we chose to show the out of gamut color, I recommend choosing perceptual for this particular image. Just as an exercise, if we were going to go out to our printer rather than to our lab, if I choose another profile, let me just get one of my papers here. Let's see, what do I have here? Let me pick up, oh, here we go. Here's a Color Monkey photo profile that I created for Canson Aquarel Rag. And by the way, simulate paper and ink, never choose that. So now if we choose relative versus perceptual, you can actually see the colors change. Relative's darker, perceptual's a little bit lighter. However, you might decide, again, since there's a lot of color out of gamut here, in this case, notice the paper is okay with the blue, but it has a problem with underneath the arch. So again, this is a subject for another day. We'll come back and talk about doing your own printing, but I just wanted you to see that perceptual versus relative, even on an sRGB monitor, will show up depending on where the destination is. Now, since labs, as I mentioned, work in sRGB, that's where we're going. We don't really see a difference between perceptual and relative here on the screen. I'm just playing it safe since there was a lot of color out of gamut in that sky. So we leave that here, and now we export the file. So if I click on export, I'm going to choose a target folder. And what I typically do, I think, did I get rid of it off my desktop? I'll create a new one. I'm going to create a new folder. In fact, I'm going to put it on my desktop, and I'm going to call it For the Lab. So I'll put all my images in here on the way to the lab. So I choose that, and file naming is fine. It's not a video. What I want to do is the lab generally wants a JPEG, and I'm going to send them a full quality JPEG. Not going to do any image sizing, and the color space is sRGB. And that's it. I click on export, and it will send out this file using the settings that I've got right here. It'll be an sRGB file with perceptual rendering. I then send this to my lab. By the way, make sure your lab doesn't mess with your images. Some labs offer you their sometimes quote-unquote premium service where their people will make adjustments. Don't let this happen, because my experience has been the people at the labs always want to play a little bit too much, and the images end up getting too contrasty and too saturated. If you do this, you can be assured that the print you get back, regardless of what kind of paper it's done on, is going to come back looking this way. Let's see. So there are a couple of other questions. Yeah, someone asked if there's a solution for Capture One, and unfortunately, at this point, no. Also, someone asked, Rick asked, should you have profiles for each lens used or just the camera? It's a good question. I have found with current lenses, never enough change between the lenses to bother. If you've got some old lenses, maybe you've got a new mirrorless camera that can take lenses from the 70s, the coatings were different. You might find a little different response. You saw how easy it is to create a profile, so give it a try and you'll get to see if it's a different. Someone mentioned that they did not see my Savannah profile show up in the list. And that's a good catch. The reason it didn't show up is because I didn't actually restart Lightroom. I'd have to restart Lightroom for that to show up. I just used some of the profiles I had already created. But good catch. You guys are keeping me on my toes. All right, so there's a landscape. Let's take a look at a portrait and do the same thing. All right, so here's a portrait of my lovely friend Cadence. And we've got soft proofing here. And again, I can look at perceptual versus relative, not seeing any changes here. Let's take a look on the clipping. And we can see in the destination, there is very, very little clipping outside of sRGB. In fact, here it is. You see this little bit of bright yellow in the green leaves here? That's all that is outside of sRGB. And it's such a little bit out that in this case, I will choose relative colorimetric for my rendering intent. So there's really nothing else left to do with this. In some cases, you might find a dramatic change depending on the type of image that you're shooting and the colors that are in that image. In that case, with this soft proofing set up, you can then make changes to the image, and since you're looking at it through the soft proofing window, that is what the print is going to look like. So again, once again, File, Export. Remember, we've got sRGB and we chose relative rendering intent this time. It's going to go into the same folder. Still 100% quality, JPEG sRGB, export, and now that image is also ready to go. I'm just looking at your questions for a second. Oh, here's a good, Tyler asked a good question. If the lab gives you an ICC profile for the printer, would I use that? Most professional labs don't do that because there's no reason for it. Their software is very good at converting the sRGB space into their printer space. One exception is actually Costco. Costco uses, last time I checked, they use Fuji Frontier printers, and they will actually give you the profile. So if they do provide you with the profile, can you use it? Absolutely, and you would load it in here. So you would tell it you would install that profile in your system. And let's, for argument's sake, let's say it was, I have an Epson P600 here. Let's say, I was going out to metallic glossy paper with photo black. Now, if I switch back and forth between relative and perceptual, you can actually see under perceptual, the image is a little bit darker than in relative. Now, this is a flavoring to your taste kind of thing. You might decide, well, gee, I kind of like the slightly darker, although relative does do a little bit better job of maintaining shadow detail. However, I think I like the perceptual rendering. So what you can do is go with that, and while you're in here, you can make any adjustments. I've already boosted the exposure a little bit. Let's say I want to bring my highlights down a little, open up my shadows, and maybe add even a little bit more saturation to the image. And now I have an image ready to go out to this particular profile. So if a lab does give you the profile, you can see that, you can choose your intent, and this is what the print will look like. And then once again, like we just had, you would just go to export, just like we did, and it tells me that there's already one there, which we did, so I'll just use a unique name since I did make some adjustments for that. So that's how you would deal with a lab profile. All right, let's jump into Photoshop. Now, why Photoshop? Well, Photoshop, our Adobe Camera Raw to be more exact, does handle things a little bit differently. So let's jump into there. In fact, here's an image. Okay, here's after my edit and after my profile has been done. Now, I want to prepare this image for editing in Photoshop because one of the things that Photoshop does is it gives you a lot more control over close color editing. So let me turn that off. And let's go into Photoshop. Let me jump over here to that. In fact, here's that image in Photoshop. So I opened it in from Lightroom. And by the way, if you use both Lightroom and Photoshop, Lightroom becomes your Adobe Camera Raw. They actually are the develop module in Lightroom is Adobe Camera Raw. So I think you'll find that's probably an easier way to work than just using Adobe Camera Raw. But once my image is in Photoshop, I can see to me, the image looks a little bit too green. The color's off. And if you've ever had a situation where the color's off, but you're not sure how to correct it, let me show you a way to do it. Now, Lightroom doesn't give you the abilities that Photoshop does. For example, I can come up and start messing with the tint. Yeah, maybe that looks a little too much, but it is global to the image. If I start messing with the color, Photoshop gives you a much better way. So let me show you my favorite way of doing that. So I'm going to go to the image and I'm going to create a color balance adjustment layer. And I've done this for many years. I used to be an art director and I needed a fast way to be able to adjust color. Sometimes I could tell just by looking at it what it needed, but other times I couldn't. And the beauty of Photoshop is you get to adjust the color for the midtones, the highlights, and the shadows. So here's what you do. First, add a bunch of cyan to the midtones. Then add a bunch of red. And you're going to see, ooh, one of them looks a lot better. Wow, doesn't the red look better? It got rid of a lot of that green. That's good. Magenta green, rarely off. I'd recommend skipping it. Usually it's only needs to be adjusted if your color temperature was way off or your light source. So for example, you had it set for daylight and you're under fluorescent lights. Let's skip down to yellow. So we'll add a bunch of yellow, add a bunch of blue. I need a little bit of blue too. So you can do, if you're not sure, you can do a lot either way. You can add a lot of yellow and a lot of blue, and then start backing off, and you're going to find one looks less bad than the other. And once that happens, then drop it down to 10-ish or so. You might even find less. So I've got the cyan here. It needs a little red. So after that's done, move on to highlights. Same exercise. Add cyan, add red. Now this becomes a mood kind of thing. I actually think it needs a little cyan. Blue, yellow. In this case, the highlights needed yellow. So notice we're getting a different response in the highlights versus the midtones. Let's see what happens with shadows. So I go to shadows, I'll add red, I'll add cyan. Nope, needs a little bit of red. Again, we'll skip magenta green, I'll add yellow, I'll add blue. It needed blue. In fact, it needed a lot of blue. All right, so let's close that. And let's turn this on and off. We'll turn this color balance on and off that I just did, and look at the difference in the image. Look how much more accurate, more beautiful this image looks like. This, by the way, is Grand Teton reflecting in the water at a place called Schwabiker Landing. Now lastly, one other thing I'm going to do to add a little bit more pop to it is I'll bring up a curves adjustment layer. And if curves kind of freak you out, either in Lightroom or in Photoshop, you have the little pointy finger thing, which is the targeted adjustment tool. And if I decide I want to maybe open the shadows a little bit, I can come into one of the shadows. And as I do this, notice you'll see the little circle on the line in the graph show up. And that's the area that's going to be adjusted. So if I click and drag up, you can see it lightens. If I click and drag down, it darkens. So if I want to add a little darkness to that, and I want to open up the midtones, I click on the mountain there, and I can come up into the sky, into the clouds, see if there's something here, open that up a little bit, and that's looking pretty good. So just what we did with those two adjustments. Notice if I turn them on and off, there's off, there's on. Look how much nicer that image looks. Now this image is ready to go to print. Now we need to soft proof it. Here's how you soft proof in Photoshop. Go to View, Proof Setup Custom, which I was already in. And again, we're going out to sRGB. If you were going out to a paper or the lab provided you with the profile, you would find that here. Notice it's the same exact list we saw when we were in Lightroom. We're going out to sRGB. Now we click Relative versus Perceptual. Again, in sRGB, we're not seeing any difference. Couple of notes in this screen. First of all, preserve RGB numbers. Never check this. Bad things will happen. Black point compensation should be on. Now notice you also have, in addition to perceptual and relative that we have in Lightroom, you have two others, saturation and absolute. The answer for those is leave them alone. They will just cause you heartache. In fact, they should get rid of them in Photoshop, or at least hide them to some kind of expert view. These are the two you want. So, also while we're in this window, under view, there is a gamut warning button here. We can click on here and you see it shows us in gray the colors that are out of gamut for the space you're going to. Now this is sRGB. If we were going out to Adobe RGB and we choose gamut warning, notice the gray disappears? Well, unfortunately lab printers don't work in Adobe RGB, but if you're going out to an inkjet printer, they generally can cover Adobe RGB. So that is one of the limitations of sRGB. It does not have as great a color range. So there are going to be some colors that are shifting. But once again, since we're working on an sRGB display, it's okay. And by the way, one last thing, if you're doing this gamut warning, that gray can be kind of hard to find. In fact, you can see it in the trees here in the middle. What you can do is, let me hit OK on here. You can go up into Photoshop's preferences and go to transparency and gamut, and you can change the gamut warning color from this gray to something you can actually see. I like this lime green. Hit OK, and now you can see it much better. These are the colors that are out of gamut. They're out of the sRGB space that are in the file. However, we are seeing this on an sRGB monitor. So what we see on the screen is what we're going to get as our print. So now we're ready to save this as a JPEG. So the first thing you need to do is convert it to sRGB. So we can convert. Notice this is in ProPhoto RGB, the raw file. We're going to send it to sRGB. We we actually didn't decide, perceptual versus relative. Remember how much of the image was out of gamut? I didn't think that was overly too much, so I'm going to stick with relative rendering for this image. Yes, use black point compensation, and I will flatten the image to preserve the appearance. Hit OK. It will go ahead and do its conversion. Now I save this as a JPEG, so I'll do save as, and here's our for the lab folder, and we're going to save it as a JPEG, and notice it says embed color profile sRGB. Click on save at its best quality. Just going to use the standard baseline, hit OK. It saves the image, and now we have an image ready to go out to the lab, and when you get it back, it's going to look like this. And unfortunately, you can't see around my house, but I have this image hanging in my dining room right now in a beautiful big canvas print, and it looks gorgeous. Okay, so Mimi asked, why not Adobe RGB? And really, basically, the answer is lab printers, if you're having conventional prints done, work in the sRGB color space or something very close to it. They actually can't address Adobe RGB, and that's something we've all been living with forever. Also, most monitors out there are sRGB displays. Even if you have one of those beautiful new IMAX Retina displays, it's an sRGB monitor. The only way you're going to get more than that is if you buy an Adobe RGB display. The high-end NECs, the high-end Samsungs, and my favorite, the AZO monitors, offer Adobe RGB displays. If you're serious about color editing, and particularly if you're going to do your own printing, because your own the new current crop of printers. My Epson P600, I also have a Canon 6350, which use many inks, anywhere from 8 to 12 inks in those printers. Those printers can print actually beyond Adobe RGB. So if you're doing your own printing, I highly recommend you get yourself an Adobe RGB monitor. Then you're going to have a better preview on your screen as to how your printer is really going to print that piece. If you're going out to a lab exclusively, if you're a wedding shooter or you just use a lab for printing, then sRGB world is what you're working in. It's what you're living in. And Marianne asked a question, again, a very good question. If the color is out of gamut, what color will actually end up printing? And the answer to that is it's going to be what you see on your sRGB screen when you're dealing with sRGB, because your screen can only show you sRGB. If you had an Adobe RGB display, you'd get a better representation of those colors, and you would see the shift actually happen on the screen. When you're dealing with the sRGB world, which we're talking about today, going out to labs, then it's going to print like you see it on your screen. So we've prepared our files for printing, both using Lightroom and Photoshop. And let's sum up, because I am just about out of time. First of all, if you're not profiling your monitor, you've got to. You got to calibrate and profile your monitor, because then it's going to put it in a standard setting so that it is doing its best job of accurately displaying the data that's in the file. Most monitors out of the box are too bright and too blue. That makes it great for games and movies, but it's really bad for color editing. So make sure you've got a calibrated monitor. Also, yes, I know I go on and on about the color checker, but to me it's the best thing you can ever put in your camera bag. It will just save you so much time in your editing, and you saw how it works. Now, keep in mind, as I've mentioned, that your prints, when you do this soft proofing, assumes you're looking at your prints under daylight, meaning somewhere between 5,000 and 5,500 lights. If you're looking at it under tungsten lights, there's going to be a change. Also, keep in mind that when you're doing this soft proofing, you're looking at the image on a backlit RGB display. It's lit from behind with RGB. And when you view your print, it's CMYK inks that are reflecting the ambient color back to you. It's two completely different ways of showing color. So understand that soft proofing is going to get you very close. It's never going to be perfect because it's two different ways of seeing color. Backlit monitor, CMYK inks with reflected light. However, if you go through this process, you will get the hang of how a print is going to look compared to your monitor. Also, I highly recommend when you're viewing your prints, if you don't have some, get yourself a couple of daylight full spectrum lamps that you can then view your prints under, and then you're going to have a real good idea how closely they match. Now, since most of us look at our prints under daylight lights, that's okay. If you're under tungsten lights are a little warmer. Our eyes adapt to that. The only problem you run into is if you get into fluorescent lights, and that's just basically a bad place to be viewing prints. But all we can do is make sure that the prints we get back from our lab matched what we saw on our screen. That's it for me for today. I'm just about out of time. We just filled our complete hour. If you have any more questions, there's also a lot more videos, both on X-Rite Photo and as well on my website on the YouTube page. Take a look at xritephoto.com. There's more details, there's more how-tos you can read up about the gear. If you've got any questions, if you've got something that's driving you nuts, feel free to send me an email as well. There's my email address. And I will do my best to get back to you as soon as possible. I know I wasn't ever able to get anywhere near all the questions that were asked. I apologize for that, or we'd be here all day answering questions. But if there's something that did not get answered that is driving you nuts, please send me an email, and I'll be happy to give you an answer. So that's it for me today. Thank you guys for the great questions. Thanks for joining us today. Hope to see you online again soon. Until next time, thanks for watching, and be well. Bye-bye.